Sunday evening. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Stuart Nadler and Benjamin Anastas with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Stuart's newest novel, Rooms for Vanishing. We're going to dive in, but I'm just going to say a quick thing. This novel examines the ways that trauma impacts memory, the way memory impacts grief, the way grief impacts the passage of time, and more and more and more, through one fragmented family's journey of survival. And before we officially dive in, I just have a few logistics to point out, some quick bios to read, and then we're going to get into it. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Stuart will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Rooms for Vanishing online using the link in the live stream description. Stuart Nadler is a recipient of the 5 Under 35 Award from the National Book Foundation and the author of 2 novels, Wise Men and The Inseparables, and a story collection, The Book of Life. He is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he was a Truman Capote Fellow and a Teaching Writing Fellow. He teaches creative writing at Boston College and is a member of the faculty of the Bennington Writing Seminars. He lives in New England. And as I mentioned earlier, Benjamin Anastas joins Stuart in conversation tonight. Ben is the author of 3 novels and the best-selling memoir, Too Good to Be True. His literary journalism, essays, reviews, and short fiction have appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, The Paris Review, The Best American Essays Anthology, and numerous other publications. He lives here in Brooklyn and is a member of the literature faculty at Bennington College. That's all from me. Please give these two a big round of applause.
Thank you. All the applause goes to Stuart tonight. It's so great to be here to celebrate your novel and talk about it with these great people. It's a privilege to be here for a lot of reasons. First, because I came to know you through teaching at the Bennington Writing Seminars, and came to know you as a writer by reading your previously published work, and then I've heard you read your short stories. Over a successive number of residencies at the MFA program. It's a low residency MFA, so students are like on campus for 10 days and go off and do their thing. Hugh is also on the faculty, and was a student. So I feel like I've watched your writing build in a very kind of real world sort of way over these last 5 or 6 years, and this novel arrived like a whole new thing to me, and I've just loved spending time with it. It's kept me spellbound for about 3 weeks now. I'm reading it and rereading it, all 445 pages, which are, each is immaculate in a kind of different way. And it's unsettling, but it's also just very beautiful. And one of the reasons why I've responded to it is that I have Austrian Jewish history. Like my maternal grandfather, Franz Wiener, is from Prague. The family name Wiener means from Vienna. So it's one of these names that Jews at the time adopted when they left the sort of patronymic, more Jewish sounding names behind and became assimilated. And so I feel like reading about Jews from Vienna is like couldn't be any closer to home. So it's been great. One of the novel's subjects is the nagging persistence of in our lives of the dead, or as one character puts it about his wife, Fania, the victim of the Nazi killing machine. What I cannot explain is that Fania is both old and young, always 26, always here in Vienna, and she has also managed to affix herself in every room beside me, on every train, one moment away. And to me, this is how people move through time, everyone moves through time this way. Just yesterday, I learned that a writer I spent some time with in the early 90s, the poet and music critic Joshua Clover, had died at the age of 63. And lo and behold, overnight, the opening line of his Wikipedia entry changed from Joshua Clover is a writer, professor of English and comparative literature at the University of California, Davis, and a revolutionary. And overnight, it changed to Joshua Clover was a writer, professor of English and comparative literature at the University of California, Davis, and a revolutionary. And of course, they added his dates too. But I feel like fiction in the United States doesn't really pay enough attention to this universal change from like the is to the was. Like we're all supposed to forget death as a fact here. and this strange, almost kind of Kabbalistic persistence of the dead in our lives. And this is one of the things that the novel really pays close attention to. I actually wanted to start the discussion tonight with a little swerve, which is to have Stuart read a few paragraphs from a short story that I first heard him read at Bennington called Fania, which is a name that appears in the novel too. And I heard him read from this, and when I was fiction editor at Bennington Review, there's copies here, and I went to the editor, Michael Zemanis, the poet. I was like, Michael, we have to publish the story, and Michael agreed. And luckily, we did. So why don't we start by having you read like the first 3 paragraphs, if I can somehow find the story. Hold on a second. Here we go. And there will be copies of the magazine at the front.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I know Monday is the best night for these things. Vanya. Within hours on the ground, I had met a woman who said, yes, I knew her. Of course I did. She was my schoolmate. I knew her all her life, right up until the end, the last moments. I even remember her as a baby, she said. It was awful what happened. First, the fear, and then the realization that the fear was real, and then the end of everything, and then the silence that comes after the fear, that comes after the realization, that comes after the end of everything. And what do you think happens then? She asked me. The answer is that you have old ladies like me who are here still and who take care of everyone and do everything and have inside ourselves all the stories, every story. So yes, of course I knew her, if that's what you want to know. I knew all of them, but awful things happen to us as well. People forget that. People concentrate only on them, as if they are so important. A chicken ran by just then, and the woman bent and took it by the feet, and she told me while smiling that she was thinking of not eating chicken anymore. Have you heard that vegetarians live forever? She asked. I'd like to do that as well, to live into eternity, to live into many different eternities if such possibilities exist, if for no other reason than to spite all of my numerous enemies. She took the chicken inside, but starting tomorrow, maybe, or the day after. What do you think about that? She said to the chicken, and then to me, vegetarianism starts tomorrow. Today we eat. I had come to the village in search of stories about the child in the photograph. In it, a girl is being walked at gunpoint through a forest that I had come to believe after months of study and after months of sitting alone with the available facts was the forest here, 2 miles east, a small forest, overgrown and deserted. The girl is very young, 6 years old maybe. She is looking directly at the camera, asking perhaps why, or perhaps even, can you do anything? You behind the camera, you looking at this image, you, Jacob Eisner, in your apartment in Boston, many futures from now, living in peace and safety, in a warm room, in a bed beside your loved one. Can you do anything to help me? It was a moment that anyone might have surmised was among the last of her life. At least I had thought so. A letter, however, arrived to my office in Boston not long ago. In it, a man said that the little girl was in fact his grandmother, that she was gone now, that she had lived a long life, had become an ophthalmologist, a specialist in all the various defects of the human eye. She had become, her grandson told me, especially skilled in repairing vision in those who suffered specific ocular abnormalities, such as people who saw others engulfed in color fields, or those who saw every object as 2 objects, an original and an echo, real and the opposite of real. People who in any other moment of time before our time might have professed with a blood-deep certainty that they were seeing spirits. The family had found this picture in her belongings and could not understand how it could be so. They had believed she was from Cincinnati. She bore no accent, told no stories, seemed to possess no hint of darkness, but yet this was her face, her eyes. We would know our grandmother anywhere. What can you tell us? We will pay what it costs. And so I had come.
Thank you. So there's this family artifact, this photograph, and then there's the work of trying to understand it and kind of decode it. And so I'm wondering, Defania and the other stories you were writing at this time represent kind of an initial attempt to write about the same history. What's the relationship between these stories and the novel that we have on our hands?
It's really interesting. I have not read that since I have not looked at that since I read it out loud.
Mhm.
And maybe there are a few people here who heard me read that, but I when I read that, but I have, as part of the job, I have to read every year.
Right.
And I was working on this. I was working on this novel for a long time, and I refused to read anything that wasn't finished. And so I wrote these stories. So I wrote these 2 books simultaneously. Basically, I wrote
Mhm.
this book in private, and I wrote this book in public.
Mhm.
And it's interesting to read that because it's clearly like I'm clearly experimenting with some of the same things that are in the novel. Like there's, I was, I had gotten to the point where I was really bored with all the kind of sentences I knew how to make,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I just like was like I just want to renovate everything about my
Mhm.
like prose making,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I was really, I was been really fixated in this idea of like I guess tense as it relates, like the idea of like the kind of indeterminacy of tense as it relates to Jewish history, right? Which is like that the past is always sort of like re-emerging into the present, and not just the way that we think about it or the way that this book thinks about it as a kind of like artifact of the 20th century, but as like a kind of artifact of the Jewish calendar, right? Where you're like, oh, we can create a kind of mirroring that happens from like the destruction of the temple all the way to like the
Mhm.
destruction of the temple in, like the massacre of the temple in Pittsburgh, right? Like
Mhm.
there's this
Mhm.
kind of thing where it's like, well, if I'm, that I think if you're raised in a certain kind of like environment, that sort of like, fear of Judeocide is like a constant echo. And so I don't really think that like the past and the present, the past tense or the present tense makes any sense. And I think that was the first window into this book, right? Which is like the premise of this book, if you don't know, is that this is family from Vienna, and in every section of this book, a different family member is narrating it, and in that section, they are the only person who has lived, or they believe themselves to be the only person who's alive. And so, like the first time I wrote, I think I wrote this section in this book where a man is waiting at a train station every day for a year, 100-year-old man. And I think when I finished that and wrote the next section, and that person and the rest, and like there was a new person who was alive,
Mhm.
something
Mhm.
kind of broke for me, where I was like, I don't really totally understand I don't really understand what this means, right? I don't, there's some
Mhm.
kind of frisson of confusion, and that seemed to me to kind of remind me of like a certain kind of like disbelief about catastrophe,
Mhm.
right? Which is like,
Mhm.
I think oftentimes people are like, could it happen? This fear of could it happen again, or could it happen here? And I was just like kind of still confused about how it could have ever happened. Any of these kind of massive catastrophes that we sort of read about or we live through, um, and just and so making this happen on the page in this tiny way, where I was kind of disbelieving, where I was creating something that I disbelieved immediately, created something that just kind of made it exciting.
Mhm.
I was
Mhm.
saying this earlier to Emma, like I finished the book and I did not know what if it I don't didn't make sense to me. Basically, I had to really think about kind of how I wanted to do it. I wrote the book totally out of order,
Mhm.
um, and I
Mhm.
wrote the book as I was writing these stories that
Mhm.
were kind of helping me write it, and sometimes there were like anecdotes, antidotes to what I was writing.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't know if that was a
Makes a lot
coherent
of
answer,
sense.
but
So tell me about the Alterman family of Vienna, and how and why you were drawn to them as characters. What are the ways in which they are representative of European Jewry at the time, and what makes them sort of singular in your mind?
I got interested in Vienna purely out of the music, which is
Mm-hmm.
like I like classical music. I was really interested in like the, you know, turn of the century, like turn of the end of the 19th century secession art,
Mm-hmm.
secession music,
Mm-hmm.
especially like the Vienna school. And I don't know, like I have no specific connection to Vienna. I'm not like particularly interested in like, Viennese culture except in this small way, but it does seem like this is this kind of like, paragon of like bourgeois Jewish uh, um, assimilation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's this kind of moment where you have like moneyed Jews who are like making art. You know, you have
Right.
like, you know,
Or
Austrian,
supporting artists and commissioning art.
right?
Right.
Yeah, and that seems you know, you have like somebody like Mahler, like who I got fascinated by, right? Who's like this Jew's like you know, this supreme genius of music who has to convert. And I like there's you know you listen to those symphonies, it's you know there's like klezmer music in the first symphony where I was like that was a real thing for me. That was something that when I heard for the first time kind of blew my mind open. I was like, oh, he's like sneaking a little Jewishness into this. And so yeah, it seemed to me as a way to kind of like you know I was kind of in I kind of just like this seems like a kind of fascinating a fascinating place to start this. Yeah. I mean, I wrote this book because I was obsessed with all this stuff,
Right.
and so
Right.
that just seemed like the kind of place to start the obsession.
Yeah, and part of what interests me thinking about it, starting with the idea of the story like Fania, which has a narrator who's sort of like a Jewish American person, like in
Yeah.
contemporary time, looking back at these characters, but the novel is much constructed entirely differently.
Yeah.
You know, it narrates the lives of these characters like in their time over a long period of time. So and you has this really strong central conceit, which is that every one of the four sort of protagonists like thinks they're the only survivor in the family. And I wonder, I mean, other than being just really compelling as a narrative conceit, you know, here are these four characters whose stories are being told, and they think they're the only ones who survived. And we get to see the ways in which they're right and wrong, you know, as we read the book. I mean, I wonder how you came upon that idea and why you think that idea fits this story in this time period in particular.
I got like really interested in like the kind of this idea of like what stories do to the way we think about history. You know, there's a kind of like narrative art about the Holocaust, right? Like all these kind of, you know, there's like all these stories about the Holocaust kind of like work the same way, right? Where like, you know, you have this sort of historical moment that's happened and then like the story is superimposed on top of it, so that like at the end of the story, if you see a movie like a Holocaust movie, you know, there's like a moment of redemption, because not because the history requires the moment of redemption or some like moment where the story is reconciled or you have some neat conclusion, but because the story requires it, you know,
Right.
like the movie requires it or the book does. And
Like the list is life, that kind of thing.
exactly, like even Schindler's List at the end, it's like there's a moment of redemption, you know, a movie that's not really about Jews, right? But like about good German people. And then you at the end where you have this moment where it's like kind of uplifting and they're laying the stones on Oscar Schindler's grave. And I was like, there's something, you know, clearly in the background of writing this, you know, like kind of our kind of like cultural morality is collapsing in the background. And these things are not disconnected for me, where I'm like, I think the way that we're kind of telling these stories is broken in some way. And so it seemed interesting to me to try to build like a literary device that worked in two ways, where like if you knew the history that I was writing about, you would know that like, you know, that these people weren't going to live, right? Statistically, like the baby, there's a baby in this that's taken, that the baby's not going to live. And then there's all this kind of unreal things that happen in this book, which are like ghosts appearing, a woman meets her doppelganger, you know, a man talks to a ghost for a long time, a 100-year-old man is running through the streets of um, Vienna, that I was trying to do something else, right? That I was trying to like ask you to kind of come a little closer to the story, to use the kind of these like magical technologies in a different way. But if you didn't know the story and you were kind of just rooting for them to find one another, like every other story about this era makes you're like, oh, they're lost, they're going to find one another, it's going to be the Holocaust actually was happy, you know, that like that it would break your heart at the end, right? Because it seemed to me like there's you know, the story requires it, like it's a hard, in any story about sort of like catastrophe or genocide, they're hard stories to believe if you've lived like a comfortable life the way I have. So like that's just, I figured this out, right? I mean, I just was like, oh, if they're all dead and they're all not dead, then I can kind of create the sense of simultaneity happening at the same time, which is I think how we deal with grief, right? We're like, you know, this idea that Didion writes about, right, where you're like, you know, you sit down to dinner and your life changes in an instant, and then you're in two places then, right? You're in the kind of world of grief, and then you're in the world before the moment of grief. And those, you know, like, so how can I play with both of these things, the sense of simultaneity at the same time? That seemed to me to be like the project. And it
Which
wasn't.
seems like a real antidote to like the traditional, typical narrative, which
Yeah.
is sort of beginning, middle, end, redemption at the end, some note of redemption at the end.
Yes, but what's
Uh-huh.
the note of redemption?
Right.
Like it doesn't seem like we're like being redeemed right now, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So you told me that you've been reading mostly from the second Moses section of the novel
Yep.
Up to now, but I wondered if you could read a very brief chapter from the first Moses cycle, which is we talked about pages 179 to 180. There's right up until like the point of view shift, and then we can talk a little more after that. Maybe introduce Moses as a character first.
Moses, my narrator, is he is when we meet him living in New York, but he grew up in Prague during the Prague Spring. All of his friends are shot by occupying Soviet troops in the center of Prague. He is meant to participate in this protest and then like sort of chickens out at the very end. In like the New York of the present day, the ghost of his old friend, this guy Ambrose, comes to visit him, and Ambrose is a murdered poet who was there that day. What else? He was in love with this woman, Sophie, at the time. She has come. She was shot, but she did not die. She came to find him in New York, and now their children are getting married. Simple concept. I think I got it all though. And so when he's writing here, they've been waiting for their grandson to be born. So, and then finally, there is Eli, rolled in cotton and wool, passed to me as babies have been passed to grandfathers since Isaac was to Abraham. Eli, a wild cry from the daylight, wearing the eyes of my mother, born back into life once again. Eli, miracle of miracles, kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. We had been in the waiting area, all of us, the entire family, never as large as it was that morning, seated by the enormous windows that overlooked the park, where out amid the trees there were, as Sophie let me know, no more fools attempting to levitate themselves. And then three things happened. First, there was Felix, who is Sophie's son, whistling a conductor's whistle, stumbling toward us, love-drunk already by the thought of his son, pulled into the universe of fathers, which is a universe of love, of course, but more specifically, a universe of impossibility. A place where one is always trying to hold something that cannot be held, such as air or sound or love itself. And then second, we sat, Eli and I, beside the window where out in the daylight the reservoir was for a moment alive with light and bird shadow, none of which he could see at this point, not even hours old. And here he was giving me the expression of a man on the verge of losing a memory, a man who knows eventually, minute by minute, that his knowledge of the past will peel away from him. Sit, I heard him telling me in that invisible language of family. Sit down and hear what I have to say. But all around us there was the clatter that attends the newly born, and he began to cry, not because of what his mother or father thought, which was that he was tired or hungry or shocked at life, but because it was gone from him, the history of him and everything before him. And as he was taken away from me, he looked back with this look all of us share, the ashen look of having possessed something crucial and elemental and having had it vanished. It was right here, he was saying to me. It was right here in my thoughts, right here. I suppose all this made me want to think about my own father, about whom I knew and remembered absolutely nothing at all. But then Sophie appeared with a small stereo that she had taken from home and put it beside Martha's bed. And while Martha slept, this is Moses' daughter, Sophie took Eli's small hand and put it to the base of the speaker. We thought for a long while about what to play, so that he would know us even when he did not know, just as your father had known his father, and probably onward, backwards. And when we did, when the first strains played, he quieted, and all of us, our family, we let the music play.
Thank you. The history of him and all that came before him, present in that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Austrian Jews in my family loved Mozart and the Requiem, and they loved Christmas.
Yeah.
They made a big deal of Christmas, made the goose, did the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, Christ wasn't present really, but it was like everything else about Christmas they loved.
Yeah. We were emailing about this, but like I got really into reading Gershom Scholem. He's the like famous kind of compiler of Jewish mysticism. He wrote like the famous books in English about, the famous books in German, I guess, about the Kabbalah. And the whole story about him is he's like this German Jew, and at Christmas, German Jews celebrate Christmas, and at Christmas his family were like fucking with him basically because he was so like pious, and they had given him a picture of Theodor Herzl under the Christmas tree, and he was like, but
the father of Zionism.
but it's an interesting thing, and then they all got killed.
Right.
But
which is the ending of all those stories, basically.
Yeah, but I don't know Mozart. I like Mozart. I don't know. I just kind of squeezed it in there, I guess. But I was interested in this idea. The most beautiful part of the Requiem is the Lacrimosa, which most of you would know if you heard it, and it's the very last piece of music that he was writing when he died. And like the story is that he's on his deathbed and he's humming it, like still trying to compose it. And then after he died, his wife went around Vienna and like asked people to write the rest of it. And so the last few pieces of the Requiem are not composed by Mozart. They're like made by his like friends, basically, or like other people trying to be Mozart. Yeah, that seems like really, really, really interesting to me, that like this kind of piece that people like adore, this like piece about death, has death in the middle of it, and then also has like the future part of it, where it's like this kind of massive transgression in it. Yeah, I don't know. I geeked out about a lot of this stuff. Everywhere I dug into these pieces of music, I found I just kind of kept opening pathways for me. And it helped me like think about this and like different ways to structure something that was really long, like I've been thinking a lot about like, what I was talking about this at lunch today, but like what a novel is supposed to be in 2025, where we have all these like other more appealing ways to like, consume narrative, and like a novel seems like immensely kind of like antique, like I tell my students that I'm writing novels, and it's like I'm like admitting that I'm like a scrimshaw artist or something, and I'm like, what is the fucking point? And I'm like, I know, what is the fucking point? Like seriously, like this is all beautiful, but everybody's brains are totally fucked right now, and so like this, I think there's a type of storytelling that like television does really well, and like that seems like that frees us up to do this other thing. And I was thinking about like, how the novel before the invention of television was like so wild and interesting, and how like music, the music of the 17th century is like completely fucking crazy, in this like pre-electric moment where they're playing on like gut strings or whatever. And thinking about these artists making this, Mozart died at 35 years old, which is like pretty heavy to think about. And I was like, so I was like, okay, well, this is just helping me think about a kind of new way to like stretch this out and make this more interesting. Basically, I'm Mozart is what I'm saying. I guess is what I'm articulating apparently.
Well, Stuart, thank you. This has been really, really wonderful, and it's the time for us to ask questions of the audience. I believe, is that right? We're there.
It's up to you.
Hi.
I already mentioned that you learned some German while you're writing this.
I tried, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm curious why you want to learn some German, but also how the language acquisition influenced the writing of the book. If it did, like they got influenced the texture before the book.
I got really obsessed with all this, writing this, and I think there was a moment where I like was like, oh, I think I have to. Where's Emma? Like I was like, I think I have to learn German, which I needed you to tell me like, no, you don't. And I was like, okay, well, this is gonna be another couple of years. But I don't know. I mean, it was just like I don't know that it helped. I mean, I think it helped bring me a little closer. Like this interesting thing happened at a certain point. Like Duolingo put Yiddish on, and which is basically like a kind of German written in Hebrew characters. And I was like, oh, this is super easy. Like Hebrew school is finally paying off. But whereas the German, I was like, oh, a little lost. But it did, it just helped me kind of bridge this kind of divide. Like I heard the, I don't know. It's I don't know that I have a neat answer for how it helped. It's clearly slowed me down. So it didn't help at all. So don't try to learn German.
Thank you. I actually am just coming from Vienna. I was
Yeah.
literally there yesterday. So I was at the Mozart house.
Yeah.
And I grew up really, my mom is a classical pianist. My family are actually Jews from the Soviet Union. And I grew up like really liking Beethoven, and I only really felt connected to Mozart, at least as a young kid, listening to the Requiem. And in the room in the Mozart house where we were yesterday, there was something about just essentially how death is kind of the only truth. And I'm just wondering, you know, I guess it's so difficult to think about death outside the house if you're a Jew of a certain generation. You know, in my household, whenever we talked about Jewish conceptions of death, it was always just like the most nebulous thing. And I never really understood whether that was because my parents grew up in an atheist state, or that there is something that is so just fundamental to Judaism about this death concept being a big question. So I'm wondering, you know, as you were writing this, how did that inform?
I'm supposed to rephrase the question. I'm not sure I'm gonna be able to do that.
I don't really know that I answered it.
Death in Judaism
And Mozart.
and
Beethoven.
Mozart. How does that inform the novel?
There's a couple of answers. You know, the thing, like, there's this story of like that like when Beethoven was like a little boy, they brought him to like play the piano in front of Mozart. You know, because there was just like, if you had a really talented kid back then, they would make the kid make money for the family and have them like be like all fancy. And so like there's like, you know, you can find these charts online of like who taught who how to play the piano that go back from like, you know, Bach all the way to like, you know, a person you could see at Carnegie Hall now. And so there's this happens simultaneous, I think, to thinking about this idea of death, which is like I think it's like, in, you know, this idea of thinking about it, or the like that like that any sort of religion provides a kind of framework for thinking about death. You know, like I've a lot of the time where I was working on this book, I was teaching at Jesuit college. You know, in my office, I had a painting of the Annunciation, like they wouldn't let me take down, and so like that it was actually really interesting to kind of be thinking about this in these two different like frameworks, I guess. And so there's not an answer to your question, but the thing I think that Judaism provides is this kind of like there's something about the Jewish calendar that is like constantly communicating like a specific story at a specific time of year, right? And the joke, of course, is that all those stories are like, you know, we were killed and now they tried to kill us, we survived, now we eat, or whatever the joke is. But I think if you're really like attuned to that, then there is a kind of like conversation about longevity. And so like that is the thing I think about when I hear this music, which is like excludes Jews explicitly, you know, despite the fact that like some of the greatest piano players of that music are Jewish people, you know, like Vladimir Ashkenazi, you know, not a Jew. So, you know, that friction was like, while making this book, that was the stuff I kept searching for, which is like, where is the friction, you know, like where's the thing, the dissonance in it, you know, this like, that is the thing that ends up happening at the very end of European Jewish civilization, which is like the art becomes extremely discordant, you know, the music is dissonant, you know, you have like Schoenberg, right, like an Austrian Jew who's making complete noise, you know, atonal 12-tone music, and ends up living like a Jew in Los Angeles. That thing got really fascinating to me, where you're like, okay, so you can trace back from Schoenberg to Mahler to Beethoven, and it's all there. And it goes from there to contemporary Beverly Hills. Schoenberg's house just burned down in the fires last month. All the like original copies of his music, or maybe were burned apparently. And so that's all that stuff seems really like fascinating. And that was the only thing that kept me working on these things, was just like being fascinated in it. Because the alternative is just like really grim. And I was not in a grim place making this. Like, I found the experience of engaging with this material really kind of like hope making, it didn't leave me hopeful, but like I think thinking about history, there's a way of thinking about history that creates, like that provides a way of thinking about the future, right? You know, this does end, whatever we're living through. Yeah.
I agree. Music and religion do help with death. Sticking with the topic of music, I know that also you have performing it in your background, and or
Yep.
yes, and I was an enormous fan of your work on the page before I met you, and then it was my enormous privilege to hear you read some of this at Bennington, and I was very struck by it. I'm generally bored by readings, and I was not, and I was curious. You know, it was essentially music. It is essentially music, and I was really curious. I know in my own musical life there was a tipping point where, because I was a recording artist before I learned how to be a performing artist, and then eventually the performances started to inform the recordings. I was wondering if you encountered anything like that on your way through this, and if any of the readings started to inform the lyrical way you would perform the writing, if that informed any of the what we're reading today.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Did the readings help inform the work? Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a very odd thing that we're asked to do as writers, right? Which is to read out loud for other adults. It's a weird thing to read to other adults. It's a weird thing to read to you, and it's a weird thing to like be read to. You know, which is like a lot of like our professional life. It's like being in a room where other people are reading to you, and like you're listening to them or not listening to them. You know, as the case may be. And it's like, you know, and yeah, I mean, yeah. So I guess the short answer is like I didn't want to be. I don't. Yeah, I don't want to be boring. And I always thought of the sentence. This is really like a dorky answer, but like I always thought of the sentence as like a kind of unit of breath. You know, the way that like poets think about it. And so there, you know, the thing that happened in my writing was like the line just kind of exploded, and that was, you know, there's something about being in an environment where you can read and like feel like you can be really messy. That was really freeing for me. Like I was talking earlier, I mean, this book, all this writing I've done this last decade, you know, writing these 2 books simultaneously, basically, and the work I'm doing now, I have felt like this sort of explosion in my artistic life, and that I think is just not. That's just not, I guess, not caring anymore about like all that the old rules, you know. Like, I mean, I was told in my MFA program that I was allowed to have 1 dream on the page and 4 exclamation points and whatever else, some other bullshit, and no jokes. I was told to have no jokes. So yeah.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about beauty in the novel, and then like when I was reading everything about like all the moments that you were talking about beauty and kind of like the character's disdain for beauty, I was thinking about like all those years ago, which was actually like like our stories of migration class, when you had like such a personal disdain for sentimentality.
Yeah. I was really thinking about like the ideas of kitsch, you know, which is like a slur sometimes against Jewish art, and like what the point, like where the limit is, like where is the limit between like, I'm sorry, like I know like Susan Sontag probably has an essay about this, but like whatever the difference between like all these different things, like sentimentality, right, or kitsch or schmaltz, all these things, and I feel like there's a kind of like inheritance that I've had as like an artist that's like thinking about Jewish life and Jewish art, that where I'm like, I kind of have to play with this thing, right? Where there's like whatever the equivalent on the page of like a really like kind of overtly stirring or like overtly beautiful piece of music is, you know, how, like what happens, what does that look like? And can I do that on the page without like hating myself? Basically, and like some of it is really beautiful, but like what does it mean to have something that's really beautiful in like a book that's filled with like darkness and something that's really terrible? All that stuff seemed interesting, right? And but I mean, I don't know, like at a lot of points in this book, the characters talk about beauty out loud, you know, about how they distrust it. And I feel like that too, even though like I'm really interested in vanity, like my own vanity, for instance. And like, so these ideas get very confusing for me. And like, I think that's what the novel's for right now, which is to try to work this stuff out. I don't know if that answers the question though.
I think we have time for one more question if somebody has one.
Yeah.
You talked about examples of Jewish stories that like are not what you wanted to do. What examples are there of ones that you maybe had in mind when you were writing this as, you know, things that you wanted to not necessarily emulate, but were inspirational?
Oh, so much. But
Do you like Malamud?
what's that?
Do you like Malamud?
No. There's that great Malamud story, the lady in the lake. You know that one? Yeah.
Not the fixer, not even the fixer.
No. The natural, the baseball one. Like somebody like Bruno Schultz. Like I kind of like yeah, like that there's only, you know, Bruno Schultz has in English has this one book left. You know, he was this kind of like Polish Jew was killed. He's really famous more for how he was killed than like for the work. The work is like kind of just this kind of like explosion of like kind of weird brilliance, you know. I'm teaching a class on Kafka right now, and you know, I kind of read Kafka as a Jewish artist, even though he's been like deracinated and like given to the world as like a, you know, Czech or German kind of white German writer or whatever. I mean, I was really trying to read like just like outside of the thing I was really kind of used to. I mean, I was really like trying to write in conversation with like somebody like Sebald, who's not a Jewish writer but only writes about Jews, or like Nicole Krauss, who's an American Jewish writer whose work I really love and who the structure of this I stole pretty explicitly. So thank you.
Just last thing, it's not too late to sue Boston College for being forced to sit underneath the Annunciation.
I don't think that'll go very far with this court.
Just something to keep in mind. Well, Stuart, this has been great.
Thank
I've
you so
loved
much
having
for
this
this
talk
time.
with you. And Emma, thanks for setting this up. And everybody at Books Are Magic, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you, Ben, for moderating such a wonderful conversation. And thank you, Ben Stuart, for celebrating this launch with us. So some final reminders before we all wrap up and head home. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us in person, we've got plenty of additional copies available for purchase at the register where you checked in. And as Ben mentioned earlier, we have a couple copies of the Bennington Review issue that Stuart read from earlier, so I definitely recommend checking that out as well. Stuart will be around to sign and personalize your books, right where my colleague Ben is standing and waving. Thanks, Ben. So we're going to have you all line up along these fiction shelves behind me. And we'll get all these chairs out of the way. We just ask that you please grab all of your personal belongings so we can make this bookstore look like a normal bookstore again. That's all. Let's give these two one last round of applause.